Hey guys, the hubby and I decided to do a little experiment to see how profitable it would be to create a quick furniture project and sell it. After a bit of brainstorming, we landed on bunk beds.
The idea was to create the simplest and quickest design in order to minimize time and maximize profits. This design does not include a ladder. We all know that kids will just climb up the footboard anyway, so we designed with this in mind. The other piece of simplicity here is that aside from the safety rail, the top bunk is identical to the bottom. It just gets flipped upside down when they're stacked.
So, if you want to see how much money you can make doing a little woodworking, keep watching.
The tools you'll need are a tape measure, a square, a miter saw or a circular saw, a drill with drilling, driving, and socket bits, and a sander. The supplies you'll need for this project are all right here.
Now, it's definitely not necessary, but this was a nice project to have a buddy for. Step 1, measure and cut.
This process required lots of measuring and lots of cutting. So much, in fact, that instead of showing you, I'm just going to give you a cut list. We started with a 2x8 and cut each of the 4 boards into 2 32-inch sections and one 78-inch section. The 2 1x8s were each cut into 4 33-inch sections. Next were the 1x6s. These 2 boards were each cut into a 33-inch section and a 78-inch section. Then we moved on to the 2x2s and cut them to 78 inches. The final cuts were the 1x3s. Each of these 17 boards were used to create 2 sections that are 39.5 inches each.
Step 2, assemble the headboards and footboards.
For this part, you'll need all of the 32-inch and 33-inch boards that you've cut. Each headboard and footboard starts with 2 2x8s and 2 1x8s. We began by marking lines that are 3 inches from one end of each 2x8 and 9 inches from the other end. This will mark the outer edge of each 1x8 crossboard. You can also see that we marked each 1x8 for screws. 3 screws will all be 1 inch from the end of the board. The 2 outer screws will be 1.5 inches from the edges, and the third will be directly in the center at 3 5/8 inch from the edge. We lined up a 1x8 so that it was 5.25 inches from the outer edge of the 2x8 and 3 inches from the end. Then drilled a pilot hole and placed the top screw into the 1x8. Then we did the same thing to the other side. At this point, we squared up the angle and secured it with the remaining 2 screws, and repeated on the other side. Once this was complete, we moved on to the next 1x8. We used the exact same process, but placed it 9 inches from the other end of the 2x8s. Once all the headboards and footboards are complete, you'll need to choose which 2 will go on top. These will need safety rails, and this is where the 33-inch 1x6s come in. We placed one 1x6 across the completed headboard so that it was flush with the end of the 2x8s and 5.25 inches from the edge. We drilled our pilot holes in a similar pattern as before and affixed the 1x6 with 1.25 inch wood screws. We then repeated the same process on the footboard of the top bunk.
Step 3, add the rails.
For this step, the first thing we did was mark the 2x8s for the rails. Each rail will line up with the 1x8 that is 9 inches from the end. So I used my speed square to make marks extending the edges of the 1x8 to a point 1.25 inches from the edge of the 2x8, connected these 2 points with a line, and placed marks for pilot holes 1.5 inches from each end point of that line. Once these were marked, we drilled the pilot holes and drove one 4.5 inch lag screw with a washer on it into each hole, just enough so that the tips of the screws were sticking out on the other side. We propped the headboard on blocks and placed it so that the tips of the screws were facing up. Then we marked this side with guidelines for where the rail would be placed. lined up with a 1x8 crossboard, and 1/2 inch from the outer edge of the 2x8. We lined up the end of a 78-inch 2x8 with the guidelines and pressed down. This transferred imprints of the screw tips to our 2x8, showing us right where to drill our pilot holes. Now, this is not the most precise way of doing this, but it worked out pretty well for this project. Since this method results in unique joints, it's important to label the end of each rail with a matching label on the headboard. Now that all the prep work is done, attaching the rails is as easy as pie. Simply lay out the headboard, footboard, and rails so that the appropriate labels match up, line up the screws with the pilot holes, and drive the screws into the rails. The easiest method here is to get all of the screws in about halfway, so that there's room to manipulate the pieces as you're trying to get them lined up. Then go back and tighten them until each screw is flush with the headboard or footboard. After we assembled both the top and bottom bunk, it was time to add the safety rails to the top bunk. We followed a method very similar to what we used for the bed rails, but since the safety rails are made from 1x6s, the measurements were slightly different. These side safety rails will be lined up with the safety rails on the headboards and footboards, and flush with the top. This will put the pilot holes 7/8 of an inch from the edge of the 2x8 and 1.5 inches from the top and bottom of the safety rail on the headboard. Once the pilot holes are drilled, we move on to the guidelines on the other side. These will line up with the top and bottom of the safety rail on the headboard and will be 1/2 inch from the edge of the 2x8. The 3-inch hex lag screws and washers go into these pilot holes, and the guidelines are once again used along with the screw tips to transfer marks for the appropriate pilot hole placement into the end of the 78-inch 1x6. Once marked, we drilled the pilot holes and attached the rails as before. We found that loosening the lag bolts on the rails below made it much easier to get these safety rails lined up. The final step in adding the rails is adding the 4 78-inch 2x2s. Their job is to hold the slats, and since the top bunk needs to be able to work no matter which way it's flipped, we opted to just install these 2x2s right in the center of the 2x8s. Since the 2x8 is actually 7 inches wide, and the 2x2 is 1.5 inches wide, we measured up 2 3/4 of an inch from the bottom of each 2x8 and marked it. Then we simply lined up the bottom of the 2x2 with our markings, drilled 5 pilot holes over the length of the 2x2, and attached it using 2.5-inch wood screws. We repeated this process for the 3 remaining bed rails.
Step 4, stack them up.
The first order of business was to mark center on the top of each bed post on the bottom bunk. We did this by drawing 2 diagonal lines on all 4 bed posts, and then drilled a hole in each with a 1/4-inch spade bit to a depth of about 1.5 inches. We cut the metal rod into 8 sections. 4 were 3 inches long and would ultimately be used for the finished product. The other 4 were 2 inches long and used strictly for marking the center of the top bed posts. We inserted the 2-inch pins into each hole and covered them with graphite. Then flipped the top bunk over and, carefully lining the posts up, stacked it on top. I then gave the top post a good couple of whacks with a mallet to transfer the graphite to the top posts. This gave us our center marks for the top bunk, and we drilled holes in each post about 1.5 inches deep.
Step 5, sand and sand and sand.
We had some important work to do with the belt sander to kick off our sanding marathon. We started by evening out the ends of the bed posts so that the top bunk would lay nice and flat against the bottom bunk. We determined these sanding lines by looking at the joints when the beds were stacked. If a joint wasn't flush, we would mark the post with a speed square at the point where it lost contact. Next, we stacked the beds and removed the bottom crossboards from the top bunk and the top crossboards from the bottom bunk. This allowed us to use the belt sander on all sides of the bed posts. The goal here was to create a smooth transition from one bed to the next. Once all of those joints were nice and even, we used orbital and detail sanders on the entire project, starting with 80 grit sandpaper and working our way up to 220. As we finished up sanding the outsides of the headboards and footboards, I replaced the crossboards on both beds. Then we continued sanding for approximately 1 million hours until our marathon was complete.
Step 6, add the slats.
These were the one thing on the cut list that we saved for the end. If everything goes exactly right, 34 slats at 39.5 inches each should do the trick, but we had a few that were a little tight and needed to be trimmed up a bit. We placed each end of the slats on the 2x2s and used a 1x3 scrap to space them out evenly. The plan was to call it good here, but I couldn't help myself. I decided to fix the end slats to the 2x2s with 1 1/4 inch wood screws. I then stapled 2 lengths of fabric trim to each slat spanning the length of the bed. I wanted a way to both keep the slats in place and make them easy to install and transport.
Step 7, stain and finish. Step 8, make it rain. At this point, I'm sure you're thinking, Lori, how much money did you guys make? Well, here's the breakdown.
We spent about $230 on materials and ultimately sold the bunk beds for $350. So the total profit was $120, which offhand sounds pretty good. Unfortunately, we spent a combined 23 hours on this project, so our hourly rate was a mere $5.22.
Now, I'm certain this process could be sped up, and it doesn't necessarily require 2 people for the job. So there's definitely potential to improve your hourly rate. However, I'm not convinced that it'll ever truly be worth it unless you can sell the beds for significantly more than what we did. So it appears this project is not the path to tremendous wealth. But hey, now we all know how to make some simple bunk beds. Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button if you enjoyed this video.